The silence in the cockpit was heavier than the 200-ton Boeing 767 Captain Robert McCann was about to fly. But it wasn't the pre-flight checks that weighed on him. It was a decision that would end a 30-year career, ground a plane full of passengers, and expose a sickness festering at 35,000 feet. It was a sickness that had just targeted a 17-year-old boy in seat 22B, a boy armed with nothing more than a cello and a dream. And as the senior flight attendant's voice crackled with false authority over the intercom, Captain McCann knew he was about to make her prejudice and his airline's cowardice everyone's problem. The air in the terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was thick with the usual cocktail of human anxiety and Cinnabon frosting. It was a controlled chaos of rolling suitcases, hurried goodbyes, and the rhythmic drone of gate announcements. For 17-year-old Mason Hart, it was the sound of opportunity. Clutched in his hand was a boarding pass for a direct flight to New York's JFK, and strapped securely to his back was the reason for the journey, a glossy carbon fiber cello case that held a 19th century instrument worth more than the car his mother drove. Mason was not your typical teenager, while his peers were obsessed with video games and social media trends. Mason's world revolved around scales sonatas and the deep, resonant voice of his cello. He was a prodigy, a fact he was too humble to admit, but one that his collection of regional competition trophies confirmed. This flight was the big one. He had been invited to audition for a coveted spot at the Juilliard School's pre-college program. It was the culmination of a decade of sacrificed weekends, calloused fingertips, and unwavering dedication. He looked the part of a modern teen, a simple grey hoodie, noise-cancelling headphones around his neck, and well-worn sneakers. But his eyes held a seriousness that was years beyond his age. He walked with a careful, deliberate gait, hyper-aware of the precious cargo he carried. He had paid extra for a window seat, with priority boarding specifically to ensure he could personally place his cello in the overhead bin as per the airline's own musical instrument policy, which he had printed out and placed in his pocket, just in case. As he stepped onto the jet bridge for Global Wings Flight 812, a wave of nervous excitement washed over him. This was it, the final leg of the journey, before the most important performance of his life. He was greeted at the aircraft door by a flight attendant whose smile was as thin and brittle as a coat of old paint. Her name tag read Reese Butler, and beneath it a pin designated her as the senior purser. She had the sharp, scrutinizing eyes of someone who had been in the job long enough to see passengers not as people, but as potential problems. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice clipped. Her eyes, however, skipped right past Mason's face and locked onto the large case on his back. A flicker of annoyance crossed her features. "That will have to be gate-checked. It's not going to fit." Mason offered a polite, practiced smile. "Good morning. It's a cello. It's approved for carry-on and fits in the overhead bin. I've checked the airline's policy and measured the case. It's compliant." Reese's smile vanished completely. "The policy is at the discretion of the cabin crew, and I'm telling you it's too big. We don't have space for oversized items." She said the words "oversized items" with a disdain that made it clear she was talking about more than just the cello. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I fly with it often. It always fits, if I could just get to my seat." 22B I can show you," Mason explained, calmly holding up his boarding pass. He knew the key was to remain polite and deferential, to not give her any ammunition. Reese snatched the boarding pass from his hand, her eyes scanning it as if searching for a forgery. 22. B. Fine. But if that thing doesn't fit, it's going back out to the gate, and you'll be responsible for any delay it causes. Understood. Understood. Mason said, his jaw tightening slightly. He walked down the narrow aisle, acutely aware of Reese's eyes boring into his back. Other passengers shifted to let him pass, their faces a mixture of curiosity and impatience. He reached his row, greeting the older woman in the aisle seat with a quiet, "Excuse me." With the ease of long practice, he unstrapped the cello case, lifted it, and slid it gently into the overhead bin above his seat. It fit perfectly, with room to spare for a few jackets. He closed the bin door with a soft, satisfying click. He thought that was the end of it. He settled into his seat, pulled out a book on music theory, and prepared to lose himself in study for the 2-hour flight. He was wrong. That click of the overhead bin door wasn't an ending. It was the sound of a starting gun, and Reese Butler had just decided she was going to win the race, no matter the cost. For the next 20 minutes, boarding proceeded as normal, the cabin filled with the low hum of conversation and the clatter of luggage. Mason remained engrossed in his book, his headphones on, but with no music playing, allowing him to be aware of his surroundings. He felt rather than saw Reese Butler pass his row several times. Each time he sensed a lingering, hostile energy directed his way. It was a feeling he was unfortunately familiar with, the subtle, unnerving sensation of being watched, judged, and found wanting for reasons he couldn't control. Once all the passengers were seated, Reese began her final sweep of the cabin before closing the main door. She moved with an air of self-importance, her gaze flitting over passengers, checking for fastened seatbelts and upright seatbacks. When she reached row 22, she stopped, her eyes fixed on the closed overhead bin above Mason's head. "Sir," she said, her voice loud enough to make the passengers in the surrounding rows look up. Mason looked up from his book. He removed his headphones. "Yes." "I need to see what's in that bin," she demanded, pointing upward. Mason was confused. "It's just my cello, ma'am, and a couple of coats. I need to personally verify the contents of the bin." She insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Her arms were crossed, her stance confrontational. The woman in the aisle seat, a lawyer named Sarah Jenkins, who was flying to New York for a deposition, looked from Reese to Mason with a frown. "He already put it up there. It fit just fine." Reese ignored her completely. Her focus was solely on Mason. "Sir, open the bin." A cold knot of dread began to form in Mason's stomach. This wasn't about the cello anymore. This was a power play. He stood up slowly, a quiet dignity in his posture. "Okay," he said, and reached up to open the bin. The cello case was exactly where he had left it. "See, it's just my instrument." Reese stared at the case, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. "That case is not properly secured." Mason blinked. "It's lying flat, just like it's supposed to. It's not moving. I'm the one who decides what's secure on this aircraft, not you," she snapped. "I want you to open the case. I need to inspect the instrument." This was a new, alarming escalation. The cabin of an airplane with its dry, pressurized air was a terrible environment for a delicate, centuries-old wooden instrument. Opening it here was a risk he was not willing to take. More than that, her demand was utterly without basis. "Ma'am, I can't do that," Mason said, his voice firm but still respectful. "This is a very valuable and fragile antique instrument. The change in humidity and pressure can damage it. There's no reason to open it. It's been through the TSA security checkpoint at the gate." Reese's eyes narrowed into slits. She saw his refusal not as a reasonable precaution, but as a direct challenge to her authority. To her, this quiet black teenager in a hoodie was being defiant, suspicious. "Are you refusing to comply with a flight crew instruction?" she asked, her voice dripping with menace. The surrounding passengers were now openly staring, their conversations silenced. A few had discreetly pulled out their phones. Sarah Jenkins, the lawyer, was one of them. She hit record, keeping the phone low in her lap. "I'm not refusing to comply," Mason said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm trying to protect my property from damage. There is no security reason to open the case. It has been screened. You are welcome to look at the outside of the case. You can see there is nothing attached to it. But I cannot open it here." "I could have anything in there." Reese's voice rose, a tremor of theatrical fear entering her tone. "It could be a weapon. It could be something dangerous." The word dangerous hung in the air, ugly and loaded. Mason felt a flush of anger and humiliation. She was painting him as a threat in front of an entire plane of people. He looked around and saw suspicion dawning on some faces, while others like Sarah looked on with disgust. "It's a cello," Mason repeated, his voice strained. "It's my life. It's how I'm trying to get into college. It's not a weapon." "I'm not going to argue with you," Reese said, her face set like stone. She took a step back, pulling her cabin phone from its cradle on the wall. "You have two choices. You either open that case for inspection right now, or you will be removed from this flight." Mason stood his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. He thought of his mother, who had worked double shifts for years to pay for his lessons, and the insurance on this instrument. He thought of the audition, the chance of a lifetime waiting for him in New York, and he thought of the quiet dignity she had always taught him to maintain, especially when the world tried to take it from him. "I will not open the case," he said, his voice clear and steady, despite the fear coiling inside him. "And you have no grounds to remove me from this flight. I am in full compliance with your airline's policies and federal aviation regulations." Reese's face twisted into a mask of vindictive fury. She held the phone to her ear. "This is Purser Butler. I have a non-compliant and potentially hostile passenger in row 22. I need security at the gate immediately. Yes, immediately. The safety of this flight is at risk." She hung up the phone with a sharp click and gave Mason a triumphant, venomous glare. "We'll see who's in compliance now." The announcement that security had been called sent a ripple of shock and unease through the cabin. The atmosphere, already tense, became thick with anxiety. Passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some looked at Mason with fear, their minds poisoned by Reese's baseless accusations. Others glared at Reese, sensing the gross injustice of the situation. Mason remained standing in the aisle, his body rigid, his expression a mixture of disbelief and steely resolve. He felt like he was in a nightmare. Sarah Jenkins, still recording, leaned forward. "This is outrageous," she whispered to the man next to her. "The kid has done nothing wrong. She's completely out of line." The man, a businessman in a crisp suit, nodded grimly. "Power trip. Seen it before. Never this bad, though." Up in the cockpit, Captain Robert McCann and his first officer, Frank, were running through their final pre-flight checklist. Rob, a man with silvering hair and the calm, steady eyes of a 30-year veteran, was known for his meticulous, no-nonsense approach. He ran his flights with quiet efficiency and had earned the respect of crews across the fleet. The cabin-ready chime, which should have sounded by now, remained silent. Instead, the intercom buzzed. It was Reese. "Flight deck, this is the purser," she said, her voice laced with a self-important urgency. "We have a slight security situation on board. We're waiting for ground security to remove a passenger. We will be delayed." Rob exchanged a look with Frank. A security removal was a serious event, one that could ground a plane for hours and trigger a mountain of paperwork. "What's the nature of the situation, Reese?" Rob asked, his voice a low, even baritone. "I have a passenger in 22B who is refusing to comply with crew instructions regarding his carry-on luggage. He's becoming belligerent. For the safety of the cabin, I've requested he be removed." The word belligerent didn't sit right with Rob. It was a loaded term often used to escalate situations rather than describe them. What specific instruction is he refusing? There was a slight pause. "He refuses to allow me to inspect the contents of his oversized baggage." "Did it not fit in the overhead?" Rob pressed. "It fit Captain, but the passenger's attitude is a security concern. He's hostile." Rob McCann didn't get to be a captain for a major airline for 3 decades by being a fool. He could read between the lines of what was said, and more importantly, what wasn't. Reese Butler had a reputation. She was by the book to a fault, but her book was often a revised edition that only she had read, one that contained unwritten rules about who belonged and who didn't. "Hold your position, Reese. Don't engage further. I'm coming back," Rob said. He unbuckled his harness. Frank, his co-pilot, looked at him with caution. "Rob, maybe we should just let security handle it. It's their jurisdiction once they're called." "It's my plane, Frank," Rob said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. "And my passengers. Until that door closes, I'm the highest authority on this vessel. I'm not letting my flight get grounded over a baggage dispute without seeing it for myself." He opened the cockpit door and stepped into the galley. The tension in the cabin was palpable. He saw 2 airport security officers making their way down the aisle toward the back of the plane, and he saw Reese standing with her arms crossed, a smug look on her face as she watched them approach Mason. Mason, for his part, stood tall, his hands held loosely at his sides. He wasn't cowering. He looked scared, but he also looked resolute. Rob's eyes swept the scene, taking in the faces of the nearby passengers. He saw the woman with her phone angled just so. He saw the angry, frustrated expressions of others. He did not see a single person who looked like they felt threatened by the young man. The only threatening presence in that aisle was Reese's suffocating aura of authority. "What's going on here?" Rob's voice cut through the tense silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried the effortless command of a man used to being listened to. Every head turned toward him. The security officers paused. Reese's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "Captain," she said, recovering quickly. "I'm handling it. This passenger is a security risk." Rob ignored her. He walked slowly down the aisle until he was standing in front of Mason. He looked the boy up and down, not with suspicion, but with a calm, appraising gaze. "Son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm Captain McCann. Can you tell me what the problem is?" Mason let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. He looked the captain in the eyes. "Sir, there is no problem. This flight attendant is demanding to open my cello case. I told her I can't do that because it could damage the instrument. It's already been cleared by security, and it's stowed in accordance with your airline's own rules." Rob turned his gaze to Reese. "Is this true? You called security because he wouldn't let you inspect a musical instrument that had already been screened by the TSA. Reese's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. He was non-compliant and hostile captain. His refusal created a suspicious situation. "No, he wasn't," a voice cut in. It was Sarah Jenkins, holding up her phone. "He was polite and calm. You were the one being hostile. You escalated this from the moment he stepped on the plane. I have the entire thing on video." The word video seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the aisle. Reese's eyes widened in panic. The two security officers exchanged an uneasy glance. They dealt with disruptive passengers all the time. They knew a legitimate threat from a manufactured one, and this situation was beginning to stink. Officer Miller, the senior of the two, spoke up. "Ma'am," he said to Reese, "is the passenger being physically or verbally abusive? His tone—" Reese stammered, her argument crumbling. It was defiant. Captain McCann had heard enough. He held up a hand, silencing everyone. He looked at Reese, and the calm warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial cold. "Reese," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you didn't call security because of a cello. You called security on a boy because you didn't like the look of him. You manufactured a threat where none existed, endangered a passenger, and delayed this flight. You have abused your authority." He then turned to the security officers. "Gentlemen, thank you for your prompt response. Your services will not be needed. There is no security threat on this aircraft. The only threat here was to a young man's property and his dignity." He looked back at Mason. "Son, I apologize on behalf of the airline. Please take your seat. Your instrument is safe." Mason nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He sat down, the ordeal seemingly over. But Captain Robert McCann was far from finished. The unraveling had just begun, and it wasn't just Reese's authority that was about to come apart at the seams. It was his own 30-year career. The security officers, visibly relieved to be extricated from the mess, gave a curt nod to the captain and retreated down the aisle. The cabin erupted in a low murmur, the tension breaking like a fever. Several passengers shot Mason sympathetic smiles. A few even offered quiet words of encouragement. The woman in the aisle seat, Sarah, gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before turning her attention back to her phone, ensuring the video file was saved and backed up. Reese Butler stood frozen, her face a pallid mask of shock and fury. She had been publicly contradicted, her authority dismantled in front of her crew, and a plane full of passengers. Humiliation radiated from her in waves. "Captain," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, "you are undermining my position. We need to discuss this in the galley." Captain McCann turned to face her fully. The aisle was narrow, forcing them into a proximity that made the confrontation intensely personal. The other two flight attendants watched from a distance, their faces pale and uncertain. "There is nothing to discuss, Reese," Rob said, his voice still low, but now carrying a weight that silenced the entire cabin. "You used the words security, hostile, and threat to terrorize a child. You didn't see a musician. You saw a stereotype. You didn't see a passenger with a valuable item. You saw an opportunity to exert power. In 30 years of flying, I have never seen such a disgusting abuse of a uniform." Reese's jaw worked, but no sound came out. She was cornered, exposed, and her only defense was a sputtering, indignant rage. "I was following protocol. I felt the situation was unsafe. You created the situation," Rob countered, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Protocol is there to ensure safety, not to be used as a weapon for your personal prejudices. You owe that young man an apology. In fact, you owe this entire cabin an apology for delaying their departure with your theatrics." An apology was the last thing Reese was capable of. Her pride, a brittle and oversized thing, would shatter before it would bend. "I will be filing a report, Captain. A full report on your interference with a cabin security matter." Rob looked at her, and something inside him, a tether of patience that had been fraying for years, finally snapped. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was about all the little ones he had seen or heard about over the years. It was about the slow, creeping corrosion of decency in the name of corporate policy and petty tyranny. It was about the airline's glossy diversity brochures that meant nothing in the face of one employee's bigotry. He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "You do that," he said. He then turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked toward the front of the plane. He paused at the intercom handset near the cockpit door. The entire plane held its breath, expecting the standard announcement about preparing for departure. What they got instead was the sound of a career ending. Rob keyed the microphone. His voice, now amplified throughout the cabin, was as clear and steady as a pilot's report on a calm day, but his words carried the force of a hurricane. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." He paused, letting the familiar words hang in the air, before taking them to a place no passenger had ever heard before. "In a few moments, I was scheduled to fly you to New York City. However, I regret to inform you that I will not be doing so. I am resigning my command of this aircraft and my position with Global Wings, effective immediately." A collective gasp swept through the plane. Frank's head whipped around in the cockpit, his eyes wide with disbelief. Rob continued, his voice unwavering. "I am a veteran of the United States Air Force and have been a commercial pilot for 30 years. I took an oath, both in the military and in this profession, to protect the lives and well-being of those entrusted to my care. That care extends beyond just the physical safety of the aircraft. It is meant to ensure a safe and respectful environment for all. Today I have seen a senior member of my own crew violate that trust in the most egregious way." He looked back down the aisle, his eyes finding Mason's. "We have a young man on this flight who is traveling to pursue a dream. He did nothing wrong. He followed every rule. And in return, he was profiled, humiliated, and threatened by an employee of this airline. An employee who, instead of being held accountable, will likely be protected by a corporate bureaucracy that values procedure over people. I have been informed that she intends to file a report against me for de-escalating the situation she created, and I have no doubt that the company will back her. They will form a committee, launch an internal review, and 6 months from now, nothing will have changed. I cannot in good conscience continue to serve as a captain for a company whose culture allows such poison to fester. To do so would make me complicit." He took a deep breath. "My father was a baggage handler for Pan Am. He taught me that every single person who steps on a plane from the CEO in first class to the student in the last row of economy deserves the same measure of dignity. It seems Global Wings has forgotten that lesson. Perhaps my resignation will serve as a reminder. Another crew will be brought in to fly you to your destination. I am truly sorry for the profound delay this will cause you, but I am more sorry for the world we live in, where a young man's talent and character are invisible to those who can only see the color of his skin. Thank you for your understanding. And to the young man in 22B, I wish you the best of luck in New York. Go show them what you've got." He released the button. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. Every passenger, every crew member was stunned. Mason Hart stared, tears welling in his eyes, at the immense sacrifice this man he had never met had just made for him. Captain Robert McCann turned, gave a short final nod to his stunned first officer, and walked to the cockpit door. He didn't look back at the cabin. He didn't look at Reese, who now stood ashen-faced and trembling. He simply stepped off the plane, leaving behind a 30-year career, a grounded Boeing 767, and the beginning of a firestorm. The moment Captain McCann stepped off the jet bridge, the fragile order of the aircraft disintegrated. The cabin, which had been silent in shock, erupted into a cacophony of frantic conversation. Passengers were on their phones, texting, tweeting, and calling loved ones to recount the unbelievable events. The 2 remaining flight attendants were overwhelmed, fielding a barrage of questions to which they had no answers. Reese Butler, meanwhile, had stumbled into the galley, her face a ghastly shade of white, looking as though she might be sick. The consequences of her actions were crashing down on her with the force of a tidal wave. For Sarah Jenkins, the lawyer in the aisle seat, the captain's speech was a call to action. She immediately trimmed the video she had taken, focusing on the core confrontation, Reese's baseless demands, Mason's calm refusal, Reese's call to security, and the captain's initial intervention. She uploaded the 2-minute clip to Twitter, tagging Global Wings and several major news outlets. Her caption was simple and devastating. On Global Wings Flight 812 from ATL to JFK. Senior Purser Reese Butler calls security on a black teen for carrying a cello. He was calm, compliant, and racially profiled. She manufactured a threat. The captain just quit his job in protest. Shame on Global Wings. Of flying while. Black Global Wings. Shame. The tweet landed on the internet with the impact of a meteorite. Within minutes it had 12 retweets. Within 10 minutes it had 1,000. By the time the passengers of Flight 812 were deplaning escorted by bewildered gate agents, the video had been viewed over 100,000 times. By the time they were sitting in the terminal, being handed meal vouchers and vague promises of a replacement crew, it was rocketing past 1 million views. The digital inferno had been lit. The names Reese Butler and Captain McCann began trending. The video was ripped and shared on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. News organizations smelling blood in the water were already dispatching reporters to JFK and Hartsfield-Jackson. The story had everything a villain, a victim, and a hero who sacrificed everything for his principles. Back in Atlanta, the Global Wings corporate office was in full-blown panic mode. Daniel Holloway, the slick, impeccably dressed vice president of public relations, was in a crisis meeting where every phone seemed to be ringing at once. "What do we have?" he barked at a subordinate. "It's a viral video, sir." A passenger filmed an incident on Flight 812. It appears a senior flight attendant, Reese Butler, had a confrontation with a young African-American passenger over a musical instrument. "How bad is it?" Holloway asked, though he already knew the answer. "It's catastrophic," the analyst replied, swiping through a tablet. The hashtags #GlobalWings, shame, and #FireReese are trending nationwide. The Captain Robert McCann, a 30-year veteran with a spotless record, resigned on the PA system. The passenger's recording of his speech is also going viral now. Holloway swore, running a hand through his perfect hair. "Get me everything on Butler and McCann. I want their full service records, commendations, complaints, everything. And get a statement ready. Standard stuff. We are aware of the incident. Conducting a full investigation. We do not tolerate discrimination. Vague non-committal bias time." Meanwhile, Mason Hart was sitting in a quiet corner of the terminal, the world swirling around him. His phone was buzzing incessantly with messages from friends who had seen the news. A local TV reporter had already found him, but he had politely declined to comment, feeling too overwhelmed. He just wanted to get to New York for his audition. That dream, which had felt so close now, seemed to be slipping away in the chaos. He was approached by a gate agent, a kind-faced woman, who looked at him with immense sympathy. "Mason Hart?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Mr. Holloway, our VP is on the phone. He'd like to speak with you." Mason hesitated, then took the offered phone. Holloway's voice was smooth, polished, and utterly insincere. He offered a profuse, scripted apology and assured Mason that the airline was taking this matter very seriously. He then made an offer. To show our profound regret for your experience, Mason, we've booked you on the next available flight. First class, of course, and we would like to offer you a voucher for $10,000 for any future travel with us as a token of our apology. Mason listened to the man's words, sounding hollow and distant. First class, $10,000. It was a bribe, a clumsy attempt to buy his silence and make the problem go away. He thought of Captain McCann, who had just thrown away his entire livelihood, not for a voucher, but for a principle. Thank you, Mr. Holloway. Mason said, his own voice sounding clearer and stronger than he expected. But I don't want your money, and I don't want your first-class seat. What I want is to know that Reese Butler will never be allowed to do to someone else what she did to me today, and I want to know what you're going to do for Captain McCann. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Daniel Holloway was not used to having his generous offers of hush money rejected, especially not by a teenager. Mason. He began, his tone shifting from patronizing to condescending. The internal employment matters of our airline are not something we can discuss. Then I guess we have nothing to discuss, Mason said, and handed the phone back to the gate agent. In that moment, Mason Hart realized the audition in New York was no longer the only important performance of his life. He now had a role to play in a much larger drama, one that was unfolding on a national stage. Across the terminal, Sarah Jenkins was on the phone with the New York Times, giving a detailed eyewitness account of the entire event and emailing them her crystal-clear video. The fire was spreading, and Global Wings had just tried to put it out with gasoline. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in corporate implosion. The story of Flight 812 was the lead item on every national news broadcast. The video played on a loop, each viewing solidifying the public's perception. Reese the bigot, Mason, the innocent victim, and Captain McCann, the folk hero. Global Wings' initial soulless corporate statement was torn to shreds by commentators and the public alike. Their stock price took a noticeable dip as calls for a boycott intensified. Daniel Holloway and the executive team were in damage control hell. Their first move was to place Reese Butler on indefinite unpaid leave pending an investigation, a transparently weak gesture that satisfied no one. Their second move was to try and manage the Captain McCann problem. They released a statement praising his long years of service, but regretting his abrupt decision made in the heat of the moment, subtly trying to frame him as unprofessional and emotionally unstable. This backfired spectacularly. Dozens of pilots and flight attendants, both former and current employees of Global Wings, began speaking to the press anonymously. They painted a picture of a toxic corporate culture that systematically ignored complaints of discrimination, especially against senior staff like Reese. They spoke of Captain McCann as a pilot's pilot, a man of unimpeachable integrity. His dramatic resignation wasn't an emotional outburst. It was the logical conclusion for a man of his character pushed too far. Captain McCann himself remained silent for 2 days. He was at home with his family fielding calls from everyone from CNN to the Ellen DeGeneres show. He ignored them all, wanting the focus to remain on Mason. Mason, meanwhile, had been flown to New York by a rival airline who had publicly offered him and his mother free flights after seeing the story. The Juilliard School, having also seen the news, reached out to him directly. They postponed his audition by a day to allow him to settle and assured him they were horrified by what he had endured. When Mason walked into that audition room, he was no longer just a talented cellist from Atlanta. He was a national figure. He was nervous, but he channeled the swirling storm of emotions, the anger, the humiliation, the gratitude into his music. He played Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. The music poured out of him, filled with a depth and a soulfulness that was heartbreakingly beautiful. It was the performance of his life. He didn't just play the notes, he told a story. The admissions panel was left speechless, and then they broke into applause. The true reckoning for Reese Butler began when her identity was leaked online. Despite the media blurring her face, internet sleuths quickly uncovered her full name, her address, and her social media profiles. The digital mob descended. She was deluged with hateful messages, threats, and an endless stream of cello emojis. She was forced to delete her accounts and essentially go into hiding. Her professional life was over. The video was so damning, her name so toxic, that no airline in the Western Hemisphere would ever hire her again. She had become the face of corporate bigotry. She hired a lawyer and began making noise about a wrongful termination and defamation lawsuit against Global Wings and Captain McCann. It was then that Sarah Jenkins delivered the final blow. As a lawyer, she knew the importance of evidence. She had not just recorded the main incident. She had also captured several minutes of audio beforehand, where Reese could be heard complaining to another flight attendant in the galley about these kids with their hoodies and their loud music, making it clear her prejudice against Mason had started long before the cello incident. Furthermore, Sarah started organizing. She reached out to other passengers from Flight 812, many of whom were eager to provide witness statements corroborating her account. A class action lawsuit against Global Wings, with Mason Hart as the lead plaintiff, began to take shape, alleging a pattern of discrimination and the creation of a hostile environment for passengers of color. Faced with an unwinnable legal battle, a PR nightmare that was costing them millions a day, and the threat of a government investigation from the Department of Transportation, Global Wings finally capitulated. Daniel Holloway was fired. Reese Butler was formally terminated for cause, and the CEO of Global Wings issued a full public video apology. He announced a complete overhaul of their discrimination and de-escalation training, a new zero-tolerance policy for employee misconduct, and a multi-million-dollar donation to a non-profit organization that supported young minority artists. Finally, on the third day, Captain McCann broke his silence. He didn't go on a talk show. He released a simple written statement. He thanked the public for their support, but urged them to focus on the real issue, the systemic prejudice that Mason Hart and countless others face every day. He announced he would be using his newfound platform to partner with the ACLU to create a new advocacy group, Wings of Justice, dedicated to fighting discrimination in the travel industry. The ramifications were vast and swift. But the final, most satisfying chapter, the chapter of hard karma, was yet to be written for the woman who had started it all. The seasons turned, carrying the story of Flight 812 from the transient inferno of the 24-hour news cycle into the more permanent realm of modern legend. For the world, it became a touchstone, a case study in corporate accountability and individual courage. But for the people whose lives were irrevocably fused to that moment, the ensuing year was not a story, but a lived reality of divergent and deeply consequential trajectories. Mason Hart's life blossomed with the vibrant intensity of a time-lapse spring. The acceptance letter from Juilliard wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a vindication, a thick, cream-colored testament to the fact that his talent was more powerful than any prejudice. Walking onto the Lincoln Center campus for the first time with his mother beside him and his cello on his back, he felt a sense of belonging so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He was no longer the boy being scrutinized in an airplane aisle. He was an artist among artists. His story, however, did not fade. It lent his music a narrative depth that captivated audiences and critics alike. He was invited to speak not just about music, but about resilience. At first hesitant, he grew into the role with a quiet grace that was far more powerful than loud rhetoric. He spoke to high school students, telling them, "Your character is like an instrument. Don't ever let anyone who doesn't know how to play it tell you what it's worth." His debut recital in New York was a triumph. The hall was filled not just with classical music aficionados, but with people who had been touched by his story. Before playing his final piece, an intricate and emotional sonata, he stood before the crowd. "There are moments that define you," he said, his voice steady. "A few minutes in an airplane aisle taught me more than 1,000 hours in a practice room. It taught me about fear and injustice, but also about profound, unexpected kindness. There is a man here tonight who in one of those moments chose to captain his conscience instead of an airplane. This is for him." A single spotlight found Captain Robert McCann in the front row. The two men, a teenager and a retiree, bound by an extraordinary circumstance, shared a look of mutual respect and gratitude that made the entire hall hold its breath. The music that followed was not just technically brilliant, it was transcendent. Captain McCann, for his part, discovered that retirement was not an ending, but a new flight plan. The initial flood of media attention gave way to the serious, grinding work of building his advocacy group, Wings of Justice. He traded his crisp pilot's uniform for simple suits and his command of a 200-ton aircraft for the command of a bustling, underfunded office filled with passionate young lawyers and activists. He found he was uniquely suited for the role. His years of methodical, safety-oriented thinking made him a formidable strategist, and his unimpeachable reputation gave his words a moral gravity that politicians and CEOs could not ignore. He testified before Congress, his calm pilot's demeanor a stark contrast to the heated rhetoric of the hearing, as he laid out a clear, actionable plan for stronger passenger protection laws. He felt a sense of purpose that in a way was even more fulfilling than guiding a plane through a stormy sky. He was no longer just responsible for getting people from point A to point B. He was helping to change the landscape for everyone. The class action lawsuit with dozens of witnesses and the irrefutable video evidence ended as expected. Global Wings, under the gun of public opinion and regulatory pressure, settled for a staggering sum that included a formal written apology to every passenger on Flight 812 and the establishment of a substantial scholarship fund for underprivileged young musicians in Mason Hart's name. The airline's transformation was painful and expensive, but necessary. They emerged a chastened, more conscious corporation, their every move now scrutinized under the bright, unforgiving light of public memory. And then there was Reese Butler. For her, there was no blossoming, no new flight plan. There was only a long, spiraling, and deeply lonely descent. Her lawsuit for wrongful termination was a farce from the start. Her lawyer, a man who had taken the case for its potential publicity, abandoned it after the discovery phase. "Reese," he had told her, his voice flat and devoid of sympathy. "There is no case. The video is a nail in your coffin. Sarah Jenkins's audio of you in the galley beforehand is them shoveling the dirt on top. We have sworn affidavits from 17 passengers and both of your fellow flight attendants. If this goes to trial, they won't just take your money. They will professionally humiliate you in a way that will make the internet look kind." The advice cost her the last of her severance pay. The legal fees from her initial filings pushed her into bankruptcy. The comfortable suburban house with its manicured lawn and two-car garage, the symbols of her senior purser status, was sold to pay off a fraction of her debts. She moved into a dingy one-bedroom apartment on the forgotten side of town, where the walls were thin and the air smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. Her professional life was a wasteland. Her name had become a verb for a certain kind of racist entitlement. She tried applying for jobs at other airlines, even budget carriers. But the moment her name was entered into a search engine, the conversation would turn cold. She tried retail. At a department store interview, a manager who recognized her abruptly ended the interview muttering about protecting their brand. She finally found a job at a telesales company under a fake name selling dubious vacation packages over the phone. The irony of her fall from a premier airline to a travel scam, a constant bitter pill. But her voice, with its distinct, sharp cadence, was eventually recognized by a co-worker who had followed the story obsessively. She was quietly let go the next day. Her world shrank until it consisted of nothing but the four walls of her apartment and the seething bitterness in her heart. She blamed Mason for being a troublemaker, Sarah Jenkins for being a meddling witch, and above all, Robert McCann for being a traitor. In her twisted narrative, she was the loyal soldier abandoned by her general, the victim of a world gone mad with political correctness. She never once considered that she was simply the architect of her own ruin. The physical toll followed the emotional one. A nagging cough became a persistent rasp. A general weariness deepened into a bone-deep exhaustion she couldn't shake. Finally, a coughing fit left her gasping for air, and she took a bus to a county health clinic. After hours of waiting on a hard plastic chair, a young, overworked doctor looked at her chart, then at her with an expression of clinical pity. It was lung cancer, advanced and aggressive. Her new reality became the beige, impersonal world of public health care. The loss of control was absolute. She who had once dictated the movements of hundreds of people with a single command was now a number on a chart waiting for hours for a dose of medication for a moment of a doctor's time. The authority she had wielded so carelessly was gone, replaced by the profound powerlessness of the sick and the poor. One evening, lying in a bed in a noisy, overcrowded ward, she stared blankly at the small television bolted to the wall. The national news was on. A special segment began commemorating the 2nd anniversary of the Wings of Justice Foundation. The screen filled with the face of Robert McCann, now greyer, but looking more at peace than she had ever seen him. He spoke about the progress they had made, the legislation they had passed. Then the report cut to Mason Hart, now a strikingly handsome young man, exuding a quiet confidence as he prepared for a charity concert at Carnegie Hall. He spoke about using his platform to ensure no other young person had to endure what he had. The newscaster recounted the story, and for a few seconds, a clip from the infamous video played. Reese saw her own face contorted with a righteous fury she no longer recognized. She saw the sneer on her lips as she demanded Mason open his case. She saw the smug triumph in her eyes when she called security, and she saw Mason frightened but unbroken standing his ground. In the sterile, antiseptic silence of her own impending end, the bitterness finally shattered and a terrible lucid understanding poured in. It wasn't a single epiphany, but a flood. She remembered the contempt she felt seeing his hoodie. She remembered the surge of power she felt challenging him. She had wanted to make him feel small to put him in his place. She had succeeded only in destroying her own. All her life she had followed the rules, climbed the ladder, and guarded her little scrap of authority, only to throw it all away in a single ugly act of prejudice. She had grounded his flight, but he had soared to the greatest heights. She had tried to silence his music, but now the whole world was listening to him play. The news segment ended. It was followed by a commercial. A bright, optimistic ad for the new Global Wings airline. It featured a montage of smiling, diverse passengers and crew members helping each other, underscored by uplifting music. The final shot was a plane taking off into a brilliant sunset, with a new corporate slogan appearing on the screen: "Global Wings, we're all going the same way." Reese Butler turned her face to the wall, a single cold tear tracing a path down her cheek. Her descent was complete. She was alone. She was sick. She was erased. She was a ghost left behind on the tarmac, while the company she gave her life to, and the boy whose life she tried to ruin, flew on without her, into a brighter sky. The story of Flight 812 is a powerful reminder that the cockpit of an airplane isn't the only place where we find captains. Sometimes they're sitting in the aisle seat with a camera phone, or they're a 17-year-old kid who refuses to have his dignity stripped away. Captain McCann's incredible sacrifice shows us that integrity isn't about what's easy. It's about what's right, even when the cost is everything. And the hard karma that found Reese Butler demonstrates a universal truth. The hatred you put out into the world will eventually find its way back to your own doorstep, leaving you grounded while the people you tried to hold down are cleared for takeoff. This story is a testament to the quiet heroes who stand up and say, "No more." If this story of justice and accountability moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to see the power of standing for what's right, and hit that subscribe button for more unforgettable real-life stories. Who is the real hero in your eyes? Let us know in the comments below.